Many of you who attended the BTS in Belfast hopefully saw the Commonwealth Tribute to Life presentations, and that was a project that was officially aligned with the 2022 Birmingham Commonwealth Games. It's an official project that's aligned with the Games, and it was designed to try and encourage sharing of knowledge and expertise amongst the Commonwealth countries. A total of 43 Commonwealth countries signed a Memorandum of Understanding, and that was also signed by 19 organisations nationally and internationally. And the aim of that Memorandum of Understanding was to try and share awareness, increase organ donation rates, and to share expertise. Now, that expertise that we can share is a two-way interaction. So some countries, such as Australia, UK and Canada, can share their policies, their pathways for a very well-developed organ donation system. But there's also much that we can learn from other countries where perhaps their organ donation systems are not quite as well developed. So, for example, we've heard earlier this morning in the NHSBT session about the reduced organ donation rates and consent rates that we get in our ethnic minority communities, for example. And many of our ethnic minority individuals in the UK originate from countries from across the Commonwealth. So there's something that we can learn from our colleagues in these Commonwealth countries with regards to how we interact, how we speak, and how we can try and improve rates.
We'll get through that. So we're going to focus on kind of the Commonwealth. We're going to be introducing some colleagues from around the Commonwealth. And also, Julie is here on stage with me today. But first of all, as it's a landmark day in one of our Commonwealth member nations, I do have to say, don't laugh, you Welsh speakers. Dydd Gwyl, Dewi Hapus in Ffrindiau Cymraeg. Happy St David's Day, thank you. Thank you. Happy St David's Day, 1st of March. So, what we're going to do now is a panel discussion. Now, it is a well-trodden path that we have looked at in the past around opt-in versus opt-out and the comparisons that we might look at there, or we might look at brain death, or how that's implemented in every country, or even the approach model. But we're not going to do that today. Actually, what we've seen this morning from our statistics colleagues around the lack of consent in Black and Asian groups, and as Adnan had pointed out as well, we want to actually look at a cultural comparison, how we, as a predominantly white organisation, approach families from different cultures and what we can learn from our colleagues around the world. And so hopefully we're going to see some colleagues on screen from India, Singapore and South Africa. Hello, can you hear us?
Hi, Phil. Hi.
Great, great. This is really good news. So our high-tech work is on point to start with. Our panelists are going to introduce themselves in a moment, and having just said that well-trodden path that we're going to try and avoid, we are going to avoid, I think we do have to have, as part of our introduction, a bit of an understanding really about whether our colleagues work in an opt-in, opt-out environment, whether they are part of a collaborative approach or whatever else. So I'm going to ask Julie to start us off, and then we're just going to hear who you are and the environment you work in, and then I will come to our Commonwealth colleagues. Pallavi, I'll start with you after Julie. Go ahead.
Thanks, Phil. So I am Julie Booth. I'm one of the specialist nurses here in Scotland, and we in the UK work in a soft opt-out system that was introduced in 2021. And ideally, our model that we use the most is a planned collaboration when we're discussing breaking bad news and the donation conversation. So generally that will involve a consultant or a doctor from the hospital, the bedside nurse, and us as a specialist nurse there to talk about organ donation as well.
Perfect, thank you very much. So Pallavi, let's come to you then. Just follow Julie's lead on that one.
So I'm Pallavi, and I represent a not-for-profit organization called the Mohan Foundation in India. We are a 25-year-old organization. We have been involved in training what are called transplant coordinators. So unlike the UK, they're not called stans, they're called the transplant coordinators. And we've been training transplant coordinators since the last almost 12, 13 years. And most of the coordinators that are working across hospitals in India have undergone training by us, so we understand them or we understand that process that they follow. We are primarily an opt-in country. We are very far away from any conversations around opt-out as yet. You want me to talk about the approach right away, Bill?
Well, just the model of your approach. Do you go collaborative, or is it something different?
So, we are trying to put those defined methods in place. There is still no one single way of doing it, but in our training, we are very strongly advocating the combined approach that NHSBT does. We have a formal MOU with NHSBT, and there has been a lot of learning from you. In fact, we took a training film and we, recreated it in our regional language, and now we are very strongly advocating a joint approach of the treating physician along with the transplant coordinator while speaking to families.
That's great, thank you. Sam, I'm going to come to you now, and just again, if you would introduce yourself and just give us a little flavour of the model of your approach and the system that you work under there.
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Samsudin, or known as Sam. So I'm a donor coordinator from the National Organ Transplant Unit in Singapore, where we have what is called as the heart of opt-out system. So myself and my colleagues, we attend to all potential donor cases across the country because we are a small country. And similar to what Julian mentioned, similar to the UK, our ideal model approach is collaborative, where we have the stakeholders such as the doctor, the nurse, and medical social workers present during end-of-life conversations.
Perfect, thank you. And then Vui.
Hi, my name is Vui. Everyone calls me Vui. I'm a transplant coordinator from Fortescue Hospital, which is based in Cape Town, South Africa. We have a bit of collaboration. We haven't really defined everything, but at the moment we're more looking into a collaborative approach. Then there's the treating team who has a nurse, and then the doctor, and then will be the transplant coordinator, myself and my colleagues, and then you have our team as well, palliative care team. So everybody's joining into the conversations. And if we don't have like an opt-in or opt-out system, but we're more like pushing people into the opt-in kind of direction.
Okay, great. I think that's really helpful to have a baseline for where we're making our comparisons as we go out through the rest of the conversation. So Kathy actually touched on something during her presentation around language and terminology and the importance of that, and some of the skills that we've seen from our specialist nurses and specialist requesters as they've been in front of grieving families, and the skill and expertise to agilely kind of navigate those conversations. But one of the things that has occurred to us, and we've heard a few times, is the importance of discussing death and dying. Now here in the UK, we've always been trained to be very clear in our language choices in that we talk about death and we talk about dying, as opposed to presenting it in a euphemistic way that could be misinterpreted, so language like they've passed on. So Julie, I'm going to start with you first. Just give us a little bit of a flavour really around why we do that, why it's important, and then again, we will come over to our Commonwealth colleagues for your opinions.
Yeah, no, absolutely, Phil. I think it's definitely really important that we use the clean language that Kathy has just been talking about as well. We know ourselves from meeting all the different donor families that really their cognitive processes are slowing down, and we're giving them so much information at that time. We need to be sure that they are clear and they understand what is being said. So we do advocate for using words such as death and dying as opposed to passed away, or just to make it quite clear that this is the situation that they're in. Okay, great. And I think we have heard that some international, countries, some cultures may find that type of language quite direct, maybe even offensive. So I'm going to open it up to the floor. Sam, I'm going to come to you first. What sort of language do you use to describe actually death and dying when you're with families? Is it as perhaps direct and as pragmatic as we use, or do you take a different approach?
Yeah, I mean, if you ask me to summarize, in preference, it should be direct. I mean, at the end of the day, the terminology that we use during such times is very important because families can be confused, can be anxious, and the terminologies that we use are very important. So in situations where someone has died, we find it useful to not only be direct, but also probably the use of the time of death together with the terminologies. It's also crucial to further ensure that there is no ambiguity that the person is dead. But we do acknowledge, especially during our trainings, we do acknowledge that, while it's ideal to be direct, there is this barrier, which Kathy mentioned as well, personalized and so on, that people have to overcome sometimes when they have, these conversations with families in having to describe someone as dying or died. So we find it useful through training to overcome those barriers by crossing those lines, by actually digging what's stopping us by saying that the person is dead. And of course, here in Singapore, I think we find it useful as well to be able to describe death in other languages, in our mother tongue languages especially, so that if we have to use it, we are able to use it confidently, without any ambiguity, and especially when certain family members don't speak the same language as the same person, same as the main spokesperson. But of course, apart from being, direct, so that there is no ambiguity, the timeliness or the empathetic use of these terms are also important, because no point being accurate through directness, but we are not being sensitive or it's brought up at the wrong time. So all of this space, comes into play together.
Great. You make a really interesting point around where different languages, actual mother tongue, as you describe, is prevalent, and I think that's something that we'll probably possibly hear from all of you. Obviously, here in the UK, English is the predominant language. You've heard me butchering the Welsh language just a few moments ago, but very rarely do we conduct those conversations in Welsh. So it's an interesting complexity that I guess layers on top of how you approach your families. Vui, what's the South African position?
Well, currently with us, we've got quite a number of different languages in South Africa, I think about 50, I'm sure. But we lead with English, depending on the family and how they come across as well. But in the Black communities mostly, it's much easier to communicate with them in their own language. And there are some words that when you say, they're a bit harsh, like Sam was saying, because you have to try and make it in a longer sentence and try and explain it more. Because like other families, they will think that you're being sensitive, but we try and accommodate them in their own language. We've got quite multiple people that can actually be translators for us, and it's quite easy in English most of the time, but some families, they take it harshly. But we always have to make sure you mention the person is dead. It's not, instead of, like we said, no longer with us, because it might not come across as the true definition of what you actually want to achieve.
So you would advocate quite a direct use of language around death and dying. Okay, fantastic, thank you. And then Pallavi, what's the Indian position on this?
So I'll agree with Sam and so there is an emphasis in our training where we advocate usage of words like death and not brain death. Okay, you talk about brain death, but ultimately the fact that the person has died has to be conveyed in those many words. Not saying he or she is being maintained on a ventilator, artificially being maintained, or has lost all reflexes, because these are all very ambiguous terms. And in our context, not all our transplant coordinators are people with nursing backgrounds. We have a lot of coordinators who are people with a social work background or a psychology or a sociology background, and not necessarily trained to speak about hardcore medical stuff, even if they have all the knowledge. So we do tell our intensivists and neuros that please tell the family that your loved one has died, and the fact that all of these conversations have to be placed in the whole end-of-life context, where you've established relationship with the families, you've been having regular conversations with them, so that when it finally comes to giving them the news of death, you're able to do so honestly and directly.
Perfect. Great, thank you for that. So I'm going to move us on a little bit to another topic area that we've been discussing around timing of the donation approach, which part of the way that so if we focus on DBD donors particularly, and Julie, I'm going to start with you. Our best practice tells us that we should speak to the family about donation after the second set of tests. Just a brief explanation why before we start thinking about the comparisons.
Yeah, so that's absolutely right, Phil. So really best practice for us here in the United Kingdom is to have that conversation with families after the second set of brainstem death testing, and that's confirmatory set of tests. The first set of BSD testing, that would be the time of death, but that second set confirms that death has occurred. And that also, the families we offer quite often, they can come and witness that second set of tests. Ultimately, that allows for that family's acceptance of what has happened really, and that death has occurred before we would move on to what happens next. We want to make sure the family are understanding and accepting.
Yeah, and then I guess it's the what happens next is if the family agree, then we go ahead with donation. If they don't, then the ventilator eventually, after some discussion, is obviously removed, and the patient will undergo kind of end-of-life care, and they'll die with their family there. But we uncovered something quite interesting, Pallavi, when we were talking to you in preparation. It might not seem like we're fully prepared, but we are, honest. So we had a good discussion about this, and you uncovered something really interesting about the Indian position around what happens if the family say no to donation after the brainstem tests. Just enlighten us on that.
That's a bit of a tricky thing because our law does not categorically state that if the family has, declined donation, that the ventilator can be switched off. So that clarity does not exist in the law, and so many physicians and medical people are wary of having this conversation. So you ask the family for donation, and the family says yes, great. But the family says no, and then they say we want a loved one back, we want the body back, and so that becomes a bit tricky. Dead for donation and not dead to be removed from the ventilator. So there needs to be better clarity around that. There are certain doctors who say that if the law tells me that if I perform both the set of tests and the person is dead, well, the person is dead for me, and with consultation with the family, I will go forward in finding ways to disconnect from the ventilator. But a lot of physicians say this needs to be clarified for us to be actively involved in this program. Yeah.
Okay, so it's a really interesting complexity, and I think we think that our approach in the UK can be quite challenging when we talk to donation or potential donor families. But what you're saying is that if the family agree to donation, then the law supports the removal of the ventilator for that to happen?
No, then it just happens automatically. The person is taken an AOT and retrieval starts, So there is no conversation about removal of the ventilator, because then it becomes a donation case.
Of course. But if they don't support donation, the law doesn't support you removing the ventilator?
It doesn't articulate clearly.
Okay, so really challenging kind of position to put your specialist, your donation transplant coordinators in there. So yeah, thank you for sharing that. We found that absolutely fascinating during our discussions leading up to today. But again, picking up on some of the work that Kathy has presented around that line, that metaphorical line that everybody seems to have a kind of a moral compass as a specialist nurse about how far you push that family that might have given a knee-jerk no. And we wanted to understand from you how far you're prepared to go, or how far you train your staff to go, or what the expectation is of your teams. And Sam, I wanted to start with you in Singapore, because purportedly you have a hard, soft, get my language right. You've got a hard opt-out system. So that's right, yeah? I hope so. That's what I've prepared. Anyway, so you've got. So anyway, Singapore purportedly has a hard opt-out system. So theoretically, even if the family say no, if there's no registration, you could potentially go ahead. Is that the case, or how does that play out with you in Singapore?
Yeah, so Phil, using the words store, hard, or opt-out system, I think doesn't really do the justice, the complexities of the legislation and also the processes that's involved in the communication and so on. But essentially, yes, what it means is that in Singapore, when the Singaporean is certified dead, his or her wishes on the organ donor registry will be respected should he be a suitable, medically suitable to be a donor. But that does not mean that we completely ignore the family's concerns if they have any. So in most cases that we encounter, usually the stepping down of hope have been done early. the co-prognosis, the various team members have been involved. So stepping down of hope has been done superbly, and the topic of organ donation, if it's applicable for that case, is brought up timely as part of a normal end-of-life conversation. It's essentially normalizing donation as part of one of the end-of-life choices.
Okay.
And we know that, and I think from studies and I think from our various own respective experiences, we know that most families do not disagree with the benefits of donation, and that if you ask them themselves, they would consider themselves to be an organ donor, probably. But, that decision is not that easy when you have to decide for a loved one, especially when most brain death cases are sudden or traumatic. I think Kathy also brought this up earlier on. When you put them in the position of decision making, somehow the legislation can help in that decision making, because it doesn't, the decision is not made by them, right? So in a way, when you respect the opt-out system, the organ donor registry, it helps to relieve some of that burden of decision making. Of course, when there is, I'm not saying that there is no or decline that the families come about, but when there is such a situation, I think the team respectfully explores what are the underlying reasons behind that decline. Essentially, whether is it what kind of lines, what kind of concerns do they have, and most of the times it's because of that uncertainty that I mentioned earlier on, or concerns with how the disease will look like after donation, whether will they be respected through the donation, whether is it in line to your religious faith, and so on. So really to take some time and attention and really journey with the family respectfully, in a respectful manner. And when these concerns are allayed, and you just refocus on the donor, how the donor was, what would he have wanted, and what kind of legacy that is leaving behind, the opt-out system actually helps to relieve some of the burden that several of us mentioned here. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm just going to push you a little bit harder on this one. If you've got an opt-in, so the patient has opted in on the organ donor register, but the family then disagree with it, it sounds like us in the UK, most families will support that. But if there are those few that say, actually, we don't want that to happen, do you still go ahead, or do you respect the family's wishes? Obviously, acknowledging that you will explore as far and trying to understand the rationale for why they wouldn't. But at the bottom line, would you still go ahead or not?
We will respect the donor's wishes in accordance to the organ donor registry.
Okay, interesting.
If I were to put the opposite to you, if a person had opted out during his lifetime, right?
Yeah.
But for some reason the families wants their loved one to be an organ donor, right? We will still respect the organ donor registry. That means the person will not be an organ donor simply because he opted out, even though the family wants the person to be an organ donor. So it's a balance of in a way respecting the person's wishes, through the organ donor registry.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. Viri, what's the position in South Africa?
We just purely depend on the family. If the family says yes, it's a go ahead. If the family says no, then we can't go beyond that. However, it does help when some families are aware that the person was registered to be an organ donor, no matter how old that registration is. If they say yes, and some have cards, because we've got the organ donor registry, but it's not a publicized thing. So if the family knows their wishes, they can go with that. However, in the case that some families are actually conflicted between one another, one would say yes and the others would say no, then that's when we take a step back, because the family have to agree amongst themselves what happens, because at the end of the day, with this great wonderful thing that we don't want the family to break up because of that good thing that's going to come out of this person's death. And so we just give them time, discuss it, and then come back to us. But at the end of the day, time also takes a lot of perspective into this. If they can't decide what to do between themselves and we run out of time, we just say, okay, fine, we're not going to be actually pursuing the whole organ donation thing in respect of the family, no matter what the wishes of the deceased are. So we just step back. Okay. But some families, you find that mostly the older man is actually the one that is misinformed. They don't understand. They don't even know what this organ donation is. Some people have just never heard of it. And we have to try and explain that to them and more make them understand, basically. But the time that this whole thing has to be explained is the worst time ever. So the one who knows who has the information, is into organ donation, doesn't have the right in the family to make the decision. So it takes quite a long time to sway them into the right direction. But some cases turn out good, some we just end up losing, and we give up because of time and the misunderstanding, basically.
Okay. Okay. So again, it sounds like family have the kind of the authoritative weight, the final say. So is that something that you see also in India, Pallavi?
Really the same. It is the family's prerogative.
Okay.
We can only give them information, help them to take an informed choice. Like I said, if there is a strong dissent between family members, we will try to work with the family members who are keen to make the donation happen with the ones that are not. But we will step back if there is a very strong dissent between family members.
Okay. Okay, that's interesting. Vui actually just said something about consensus and about when you've got a family, perhaps even a big family, and that kind of brings us on to a topic that we were going to discuss about the decision makers and the number of people in the room. And again, Julie, part of our training is we've always kind of said, try and just slim it down. If you enter an intensive care unit and you've got 20 family members in the room, slim it down to the key people. But that might not be the case in other cultures. But what's our position? Why do we do that? What's the rationale there for it?
So I think why we want the streamlined family there is we really want the nearest and dearest, and to establish the people that knew that person best, because these are really important conversations we're having with them. And actually it is laid out in our law as well, with our highest qualifying relationship and our nearest relative as well, that they are the people that we would want to be having these conversations with. I think as well, we know from like the COVID pandemic as well, some of our family rooms that we have, the space can be quite minimal. So really we can't have large volumes of people, just in a sort of capacity side of things as well. It can be really challenging though. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think that's an important point. There's a practical side of it in that the rooms are always tiny. They're always about 500 degrees as well. But also the legal side of these things is that we know who we should be speaking to as it's laid out in law. Pallavi, if you're met with a big family, or one of your team is met by a big family, do you take a similar approach to the UK and try and slim that down, or are you trying to speak to everybody? I know that different cultures take a different approach, and there might be kind of some rituals or people involved that need to be there as part of the family decision-making process. What's your take there?
So that's definitely a challenge in our country. Usually these are joint families, and we have an additional problem. It's not always just the families. Sometimes village heads and village elders are part of the process, it's what we call panchayat. So sometimes the family is actually not there. Very often in the region that I work, in the neighboring state called Haryana, women are not allowed to come out of the house. So there could be a husband would have died, and I don't have the family, the wife to speak to. She's really not there in the picture. So we have no option but to work with the extended family and also the villagers sometimes to get to the right person, So it is definitely a challenge, and I don't know if we can create situations like Julie mentioned, where we say only some people will enter only the immediate relatives will enter, because sometimes the decision makers perhaps may not be immediate blood relatives. So you have to respect that in our context and try to...
Yeah. So I'm interested in that in terms of then if you've got... So how is there a decision reached? Is it a consensus, or will somebody naturally take the lead and say, this is what we're doing?
A combination of both. In certain families, it would be a consensus. They say, I can't decide. The village elder will decide, or the family elder will decide. In certain cases, I remember a family, while the rest of the extended family was just not interested, both the sons, young people, they were I think in their 20s, said we want to go ahead and we will bring our mom on board. She had not come to the hospital. So it's really a combination of both, and they were able to take that strong decision and decide this is what we want to do as a family. So yeah.
Okay. Vuri, I see you nodding along with this. It's something that I guess there must be, are you nodding along because there's parallels that you see in South Africa?
Yes, I find it very interesting because we mainly concentrate, like Shirley was saying, the immediate family. I mean, the rooms are small and COVID doesn't want many people in the space. So we stick directly to the blood relatives. But as you know, South Africa is huge and we've got a lot of, because we do accept foreigners as well if they want to donate. But you find that the one says, this is my brother, this is my uncle, only to find out they're not even related. They're just friends, or they come from the same village, then they come in front of us, then they behave and then pretend to be family. But one thing always strikes me is that when they all agree to this and you put the piece of paper in front of them, they have to sign, then that's when the truth comes out. Actually, I can't sign. Let's wait for the actual brother. Oh, let's wait for the sister. I'm just a friend. I'm a family friend. We've grew up together, such things. But we always tone it down to immediate family, the parents, partner, the siblings, and the children, if they're in the rightful age to consent, because they have to all agree to this whole thing. So it makes it easy in that way. We just put a paper in front of them and they will all back down.
Okay. I don't know if you can hear it, Vuri, but our audience has got a knowing chuckle about them. They can relate to what you're saying about when you put pen to paper, the truth comes out. So yeah, very good. Sam, how about with you? Do you have similar experiences to our other colleagues there?
Very, very different and very interesting to hear the difficulties and to sort of put things into perspective for the situation in Singapore as well. I guess ideally in Singapore as well, when we have such conversations, it's always with the few key people or those close to the patient. But we also recognize that every family is different. Some may request for larger family groups to be present, or maybe some powerful support person like a religious leader to be around as well, because it is important to them. So we have to be aware that sometimes, these are important to the family. And sometimes when we are in a room full of people, we also realize that, those people who are the main spokesperson, the ones that are talking the most or the loudest, you may not necessarily be the decision makers. So usually the quiet one in the corner who's nodding is actually the one, the so-called key leader in the group. And also sometimes, I don't know, close families may want everyone to be together so that everyone's on the same page or something like that. Yeah, so ideally, lesser the better, but every family is different and we try to cater. And of course, like what you said, COVID complicated things during the pandemic.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm just going to move on to a kind of a different topic area around not just with regard to the number of people in the room, but also the religion that might prevail in that conversation. So in the UK, Julie, we don't necessarily train specifics on each religion because there are so many, and different people's devotion to that religion will differ. My relationship with Christianity might be different to yours, and you can just multiply that by a million across all the religions. So why don't we do that, and what approach do we take?
I think that's the thing, Phil. I don't think we're expected to be experts in every single religion. As you say, there's so many differences, and I think it's important that we respect that. But ultimately, I think what we need to do and what we do strive to do is actually find out from that family what is important to them, and then we best support that whatever way possible. But we took that humble approach as such to really get into the bottom of what is important to that family and to their loved one as well.
Yeah, exactly. So being guided by that family, what they want, what they need. So again, across your countries, there'll be some similar religions that we're familiar with here, but there may be some different as well. Do you, when you're training your staff, do you take an approach of training on specific religions, giving your staff an in-depth knowledge? Is that something that we might want to consider doing here? Or is it, I don't know what the alternative is. What is your approach? Pallavi, let's start with you.
So no, like I agree with what Julie said, and then it is difficult to find. But we've had in the past, we've had religious conclaves. We've invited religious leaders from various religions in the country to understand what they are saying. So help our transplant coordinators see what, because to be honest, no religion has anything written about organ donation. It could only really be what the religious leaders are espousing. So really coming down to what Julie says, what really means for that family, giving them information, but just being sensitive to understand which religion they come from. That's part of the preparation when you're approaching the family. It perhaps would help, is what we tell the transplant coordinators, but no specific training with individuals.
Okay, thank you. Sam, is that similar for you?
Yeah, largely the same. I think our training does not actually train on the specifics of religion, but rather, similarly to how to cross those barriers, those lines. I think especially in Singapore, there is this tendency to be afraid to talk about religion with the fear of offending the other person's religion. But I think most of our training, focus on how to understand what does the vision or the mission means in their religion by, asking questions, exploring, while also respecting that we just want to know and understand better. Because just to give a little bit context as well, the organ donation law in Singapore only became opt-out also through consultations with religious groups and so on. So I would say that most religious groups support organ donation in Singapore. So while we don't train the necessary specifics into religious topics and so on, we explore how to understand what's the concerns. If they're using religious concerns, is it really truly religious, or is it because they are worried of things like whether the disease is being respected? Because no matter whatever the religion is, all organ donors are being respected.
Yeah, fantastic. And Fui, what's your...
Similar to what everyone else is saying, we don't get necessarily trained on each religion. It's the family leads you most of the time, because when you come, it depends how they come across to you, because if you assume, for instance, in South Africa, most people are Christians, right? We do have a lot of other religions, but when you meet someone, unless you speak to them and how they speak to you, that helps guide you how to carry on with the whole conversation. But we always treat them the same with the utmost respect. And if they actually voice it, that this is their religion, at least it gives you an idea, because some families, they will actually say, no, our religion is like this, and this is how we do things. Then it takes you to a different direction, and then you change the whole conversation into a much more respectful manner to accommodate them in their religion.
Great, perfect. And Sam, actually, you raised a point around consultation and engagement, and I think that's something that we feel like we've done very well in the UK when it came to changing to opt-out systems across each of the nations that have implemented them, is that we went to many of the big religions, some of whom had been quite reticent and reluctant to engage around organ donation, and just kind of ask them, what do you need from us? How can we help? How can we show you that your religion is compatible with organ donation? Or what do we need to know more to provide you with that assurance? So I think you're absolutely right. There's the micro level with the family, on the face-to-face, respect them, take that humble approach that we've described. But there's a bigger macro piece around engagement and trust and that sort of thing with those religions. And I think it's something we feel like we've done pretty well in the UK.
I don't know about, sorry.
Go ahead.
Others, but in my experience, I've had very few families who've really brought in religion as a reason to not to donate. They have more real concerns, and I don't know. It hasn't been such a huge challenge for me. I don't know in terms of percentage. Perhaps 15% of the families would have brought up religion as a reason to know. It's either just it's either lack of trust in the system, or they need to know if there's a proper allocation system, or how would the body look post retrieval, or the delay in cremation. Those are the concerns that usually people bring up, you know.
Yeah, and I think that's something that the specialist nurses in the room will certainly see, that where a family might refuse on religious or cultural grounds, actually the underlying factor is perhaps what you've just described around healthcare mistrust or disfigurement, and we saw that again from what Kathy was describing. So yeah, you're absolutely right there.